Good evening, everyone. I'm Valerie Augustin, Associate Professor of Architecture here at the USC School of Architecture, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our final lecture of our fall lecture series, and we're excited to introduce you to Liz Ogbu. I'm going to share with you a little bit about our dynamic speaker this evening. Liz is a designer, urbanist, and spatial justice activist. Liz is a global expert on the engaging and transforming unjust on urban environments. From designing shelters for immigrant day laborers in the US to a water and health social enterprise for low-income Kenyans, Liz has a long history of working with communities in need to leverage the power of design to catalyze community healing and foster environments that supports people's capacity to thrive. She is founder and principal of Studio O, a multidisciplinary design consultancy that works at the intersection of racial and spatial justice. In addition to her practice, Liz has held academic appointments at several institutions, including UC Berkeley, Stanford Z School, and the University of Virginia. She has previously served as the Droga architect in residence in Australia, investigating urban marginalized populations and community development practices in the country. Liz has also written for and been profiled in publications such as the New York Times, Bloomberg, CityLab, and the Journal of Urban Design. Her projects have been featured in museum exhibitions and received numerous design awards globally. Her honors include an IDEO.org Global Fellow. She's a TED Woman speaker, Aspen Ideas Scholar, Senior Fellow of the Design Futures Council, and one of Public Interest Design's top 100. She earned architecture degrees from Wellesley College and from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. So with this, I'll turn it over to Liz, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, Valerie. And it's a pleasure to be here, at least virtually, with all of you. I keep on assuming at some point we'll get used to all of this, but it still feels weird. So I'm sorry that I can't actually see your faces, but I'm excited to share a little bit of what I'm thinking about right now and share some of my projects and hopefully have a pretty good conversation on the other side of that. So before I begin, I always like to give a little bit of a land acknowledgement, especially since we're in disparate places. I want to at least be able to say where I am beaming in from. So I am on the land that was originally stewarded by the Chechenian-speaking Ohlone people. It is more commonly known today as Oakland, and the Chechenian-speaking people are still around today, organized as part of the Confederate villages of Lisjan. And in invoking them and in acknowledgement that there have been people on this land, I want to acknowledge that there have also been, that was the start of a lot of people whose bodies were never properly valued, but who have contributed to making this place what it is. And so in invoking their spirit, I acknowledge that history, and I acknowledge that part of my work is to make sure that we don't have a future in which we don't acknowledge people properly or value their contributions or their right to exist. So with that, I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully the Zoom gods are working in our favor, and that works. So I've been joking that pretty much every lecture I've given since March 2020 has been called Design in the Apocalypse. And that's really because it's a different lecture each time. There's some similarities, but I really am just trying to be present to what it means to be thinking about design in this moment, to be practicing design in this moment. And so what you'll see tonight is a little bit of a window into how I'm thinking about that. And I'll explain more about the apocalypse bit in a few minutes. But, you know, in particular, I think a lot of what my work revolves around is this idea of healing. And I know that healing can be a bit of an odd word right now, especially if we think about the fact that, you know, there's most recently in the last week, this new variant that's been discovered. And so it may be feeling weird how to hold it. But healing is something that I've really felt is important that we consider as designers. And I remember reading this quote pretty early in the pandemic, and it really struck me that one of the conditions for, and one of the requirements for healing is mourning. And in order to mourn one's pain and suffering, the trauma itself has to be acknowledged. The trauma is not post, it is very current. And so I think, when we think about what can architecture do in times like this, we may think about the parklets that are springing up, or how we keep people safe indoors. But I want to kind of point to the idea that maybe there's a bigger thing that we need to take on. And that if we think about this idea of healing and what is our role in that conversation, I really think it's about what is our role in helping everyone kind of collectively engage with the trauma that continues to exist. So for me, one of the lenses through which I think about healing and trauma is the idea of spatial justice. And this has been something that has been a core part of my work for many years. For those of you who are not familiar with spatial justice, it's a term that was coined by geographers a number of decades ago. And it basically means that justice has a geography, and that the equitable distribution of access, services, and outcomes should be a basic human right. And the reality is that we don't have spatial justice when in countless cities across the country and even around the world, it's possible to see differences in which neighborhoods get the industrial uses versus which ones get the gleaming towers. Oops. Which neighborhoods get the insufficient bus routes versus the multi-million-dollar transit centers, and which neighborhoods get the plethora of vacant lots as opposed to the nice parks. And the reality is that this is just not only a condition of space, right? So if we think about overlaying demographics to each of those scenes that I just showed, we would find that spatial justice is intimately connected to racial and social justice, because very often Black, Brown, Indigenous, and poor communities have disproportionately had less access. And the reality also is that that often and sadly is no accident. And so if we think about what is our intersection as a profession into what is happening right now, it's really that conditions like that exist, and that those conditions are places in which trauma is perpetually occurring and harm is perpetually occurring. And so knowing that they did not just spring up overnight or on their own, I think the question becomes, what do we as a profession do around addressing that? For me, over the course of the last 22 months at this point, this intersection between race and space, I think, has continued to beam through our social media feeds and television news and newspapers and all of that stuff. That, the idea that we have these spaces where Black men and women are being senselessly killed, often in the public realm, that we have neighborhoods of color, particularly poor neighborhoods of color, from which we derive most of the essential workers. And all of a sudden we're having a conversation about that work being essential, to even thinking about what is the significantly higher death toll in Indigenous, Black, Brown, and poor communities. And so all of those conditions that have come live to us over the course of the last 22 months have been textbook demonstrations of what the intersection of race and space looks like. And for me, what they also really bring out is the sense that it feels like we've been here before. And we've been in this place where there's a moment where we're all of a sudden recognizing that there is this intersection between race and space. And as I started to think about it, I really came to think that it feels like we're actually caught in this loop where we only seem to know two states: the state of emergency or urgency, and the state of complacency. And in the state of urgency, the idea is, how can we do enough to get past this moment? In many ways, you might say, if we think about what happened over the course of last summer in particular with the racial uprisings, that was often done in this sense of urgency, or even some of the reactions to COVID. But then oftentimes what happens is, once we, and I mean that more in a kind of collective, systemic, and systems of oppression we, feels like we've done enough, then we kind of shift into this state of complacency. And that's often because to be in a state of urgency to confront these issues that are deeply systemic, it actually feels uncomfortable. And really there's a desire to like, how can we do enough that we can get back into a place where it's normal, right? And so I really think a lot of what predicates how we operate is often how can we do enough that we can forget and forget that we're uncomfortable, forget that these things don't work the way that we would like them to, forget that there are so many people who live in conditions that do not value their right to exist. And so in many ways, the idea is like, let us do just enough and we can shift into this place where complacency effectively is business as usual, maybe with a better Band-Aid based on what we did before. And so I don't know about you, but I feel as if I'm really tired of that loop. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about as I think about what does it mean to hold healing in this time is like, how do we break the loop? How does the conversation of healing not be like, well, how can we do enough to make it a little bit better? But literally, how do we start to do things that have the potential to systemically change what business as usual means? And so for me, that really then kind of brought in this space of the apocalypse. And so I would say I've been calling this time the apocalypse since the beginning, and some of it's tongue in cheek just because everything is so crazy. But I also really deeply mean the like historical meaning of it. So apocalypse comes from the ancient Greek word that means an unveiling or an uncovering or a revelation. And I think that if we think about what has happened over the course of the last 22 months, it does have that kind of feeling to it. And this quote by the Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, I think really speaks to that, of this idea that the virus might not know boundaries or borders, but it knows how to follow the systems of injustice that are already in place. So if we think about the scenes that we have seen over the last 20 months, let us be clear, the fact that there were millions living with housing and food insecurity was not a new phenomenon. The fact that Indigenous, Black, Brown, and poor communities had significantly poorer health outcomes and higher incidence of early death, or the fact that public space was not necessarily a universal safe space for people with skin color like mine or anything that existed outside of the like white, and I would also say male hierarchy. None of those things were new. What was new is that it felt like we had all slowed down enough and that the world had gotten quiet enough that we could all finally sit with the reality of a world that is operating exactly as designed. And so in that landscape, I sort of asked, well, if we're going to say like return to normal, that means that we're returning to a state where we just accept these as normative conditions. And what this time would seem to be inviting us to is to take the opportunity to break free from that. And so as an architect and as a spatial justice activist, I sort of hold that to like, okay, how can I funnel the work that I am doing really through this lens of breaking free? And so when I talk about healing, thinking about what does it mean for me to be a caretaker of the built environment and participate in this conversation of there's going to be a new normal, and how do I use my ability to design things, to create things, to imagine things, to really set up what the terms and conditions of that new normal should be. And so I'm going to show you 3 projects. They're actually projects that I've been working on for many years. Some have had different shifts over this sort of particular funky time, but I think that the underlying principles of what they have been aspiring to really speak to the conversation I'm trying to have as a designer of what it means to think through how do we break the loop. So the first project is located in East Palo Alto, California. It's called Woodland Park. It's a housing development, and I think perhaps just to give a little bit of context, East Palo Alto is kind of like the oasis of poverty in Silicon Valley. Facebook, or Meta, as it's now calling itself, is located on the edge of the city. And if you were a cleaner at Facebook, this is probably one of the few places for many, many miles that you could afford to possibly find a place to live. And it is also, the city is also kind of a textbook example of what the lack of spatial justice looks like. So there was a freeway that went in the 60s when it wanted to be extended, just so happened to be extended right through the middle of town. When the city wanted to incorporate various more well-off neighborhoods, sort of carved out various pieces so that the city was left with a very low tax base. But it is also a place that shows like resiliency. And so it's led by people of color. And even though it has a huge population of low wage workers, they've really been fighting to make it better. If you're interested in knowing more about East Palo Alto, it was actually covered as a case study in Richard Rothstein's Color of Law. Anyway, Woodland Park, it's located on one side of town. It is actually 1,800 units spread across a wide portfolio of buildings. And I was brought in almost 5 years ago by a new owner who had taken over and had actually taken over from two successive quasi-slumlords. And my remit was to figure out how to improve the quality of life for people living there. And so when I think about what healing means, it's often about this idea of how do we make space to actually listen to the people who have been most harmed by the conditions of the past. And so, you know, I'm sort of notorious amongst my clients because I often refuse to hold community meetings at the beginning of projects because I find them to be heavily transactional. Often an architect or an owner standing up front saying, this is what we're going to do for you, as opposed to actually taking the time to listen and understand what people want to see and also what their lives are like so that you could actually appropriately design something. So in this case, one of the first things that we did was we held a series of listening sessions. And to be frank, I got yelled at a lot in these listening sessions. And oftentimes that was because for many people, this was the first time that anyone had come in many years to actually talk to them, to listen to them. And at some point, what we were dealing with was the fact that they had stopped complaining, they had stopped fighting because they were so tired of not being listened to. And so it was really important to set the context of like, our only agenda here is to really understand your lives and understand this community so that then together we can actually figure out what we can create. And so I think the importance of listening as the first act of healing is something that, you know, sounds so simple, but strangely within our design processes is often underappreciated. So what you see here is a pop-up park that was not conceived of prior to us going in and having the listening sessions, but it's actually an idea that emanated once we had enough conversations that allowed the expressions of pain to give way to the expressions of hope. And I think one of the important things about thinking about this idea of listening is also that you continue to ask questions that allow you to probe to the depths of, well, what is it truly that you need to solve for? So one of the things that we heard is, you know, there are a lot of shift workers. There was no open space actually on our side of town at all. And because people are often shift workers and there's no open space and there's also not very many sidewalks, one, kids were playing out in the street, which was very dangerous. And the adults were feeling that they had no place in which to relax. We also have a high percentage of overcrowding in the units on this side of town. And so when we talked to them about, well, how do you stay healthy? How do you relax? It became clear that building a park was not enough. And so one of the things that we did is we formed a partnership with the YMCA, which was on the other side of town. And we created a program where the YMCA is actually coming and providing classes like yoga, which is what you see on the right. Zumba is heavily oversubscribed. There's a walking club. And so basically things to actually enable people to use the space. And then this park was actually a second park that we created. You can imagine with 1,800 units spread over a pretty good real estate that there are some units for whom the park we created originally was actually quite far away. And so this is a second park that we created about a year after the first. And what was really cool about this park was that it was residents who lived closer to this spot that came and actually advocated and created a letter to ask for the ownership to give them this park. And what I love about that is I think that part of the work that I do is not just delivering spaces, not just delivering programs, but actually building relationships between the residents of a particular area and the folks who control the land to really make sure that there's a way in which power is not just held by the folks who have the money. And so the fact that the residents kind of came together, and we've actually now created a resident advisory committee that we're building these relationships that talk about how could we co-steward the site. And I think that that's something that could only come from a first act of listening. Sort of in between that first pop-up park and the second pop-up park, we decided to move forward with a redevelopment of a portion of the property. It's a pretty small, only about 4% of the units, but a lot of the buildings that are in this development are 50 to 100 years old. So they're actually past their lifetime. And what was interesting about the process that we did is that the conversations and the co-design processes that we had that helped us create the first park, we were basically able to use as a prototype for what co-design could look like for more permanent redevelopment, which I think was really important because oftentimes one of the things that happens in these situations is that there's a lack of trust, right? There's a fear that, oh, if you want to build something new, this is actually an on-ramp to displacement. And so really using that to sort of say that, like, really what we're trying to do is co-design with you and build your capacity to stay. And in this case, everybody who lived here is guaranteed to be able to stay, but also to kind of say that you really get to say what you want to see here. And so one of the things that I often do with a lot of my projects is that when there is a design that is created, really making sure that people understand how what they said ties into what gets designed. And so really thinking of design, like I said, as a conversation, sort of call and response. And so what you see here is actually a portion of that new redevelopment, and it actually includes a park space that we can't officially call a park because it's not going to be a city park, but a lot of the design of it is really informed by things we learned through the pop-up park process. For me, this act of caretaking is also, and healing also comes through this idea that it's not just about what you build at the end, but like really the process to get there, which I think the last project really spoke to this idea of listening. But I also think there's another thing of like, what is the reckoning process? Because of the fact that there has been harm, it's not automatic like, oh, let me provide you with this beautiful thing and that like heals all wounds. It's really that there has to be a process where people are actually holding the stories of harm and we're talking through it. And there's an acknowledgement of what has been done as part of the healing process. So that has been happening in a project I've been working on for 8 years at this point in San Francisco called Now Hunters Point. If you've seen my TED Talk, I talk about it. So it was for many years this power plant that existed in this community of Bayview Hunters Point, which is located in the southeastern quadrant of San Francisco. It is a historic working class African-American neighborhood. Again, example of a lack of spatial justice. So lots of industrial uses like this power plant, one of the largest sewage treatment plants that's located near a residential neighborhood in the country is located here. If you think about San Francisco, and you probably have heard about our crazy home prices. So pre-pandemic, the median home price in San Francisco was 1.5 million. The median annual income in this neighborhood was 63,000. So there's a lot of conditions here that talk about what that lack of justice and access looks like. But in the late 90s, the mothers in the public housing here that's on the hill that's overlooked the plant fought for its closure, and they were successful. The PG&E tore it down, capped the site with asphalt, and then was actually just going to leave it to be vacant until redevelopment could occur, which at the time was estimated to be a decade, but now is like more like 2 decades. And so I'm part of a team that was brought in to figure out, well, how could you program the site with interim activity that could actually serve a community benefit? And so we did it in partnership with community members and community organizations, and have done everything from job training workshops to Naniel Circus, to even in COVID, I think one of the things that's important to understand is anytime someone's giving you the resources to make decisions about what happens on a site or in a community, that's power. And so part of what I think we need to hold is like, what do you do with that power? So when COVID hit, we couldn't do any of this amazing programming. But we had a budget that had already been approved for the year. And so we reached out to our community partners and asked, what is the greatest need in the community right now? And food insecurity was what came out. And so we hustled, leveraged our contacts, and were able to form a partnership first with the San Francisco Produce Market, and then through the food bank to actually do a food giveaway at our site. And that is something that we had going weekly and then a couple times a month pretty consistently through the pandemic up until this summer. And collectively, we had given away over 10,000 bags of food. There is also a permanent piece to this project that had been able to move forward. So the shoreline edge of the site actually still needed to be remediated. And so we worked with PG&E and the community to talk about, well, how could we restore it, not just by putting some native grasses on it, but like actually restore it to a higher level and turn it into a shoreline park. And so a lot of the meetings that we had actually served as community engagement opportunities to create the park and also do things like interpretive signage that would tell the story of the community. But I actually think one of the richest parts of this project came in the moments that we had in the process to actually do the reckoning that I was talking about. And so in this case, that came both at the beginning of the project. So the very first thing that we did as part of this project was a partnership with StoryCorps, and we recorded the stories of folks who had been involved in the fight to close the power plant. And when you see particularly these quotes that appear on furniture, they're actually quotes from those StoryCorps recordings. And that was really important to the community in the sense that there would be these stories that would never be lost, which was one of their fears of what would happen in this neighborhood. And then more recently, right before the pandemic, we sort of did a year-long collaboration with the local artist, Chris Johnson, who had been one of the creators of the Question Bridge Black Male Project, which is in a number of museum permanent collections across the world, actually. And we basically set up the same premise of Question Bridge, but used it to ask a question about race and identity and space. And so we had activities in all of our events that engaged the community in that conversation. And then we ended with a closing symposium with artists and community members that had a dialogue of what that does that mean? Because from the beginning of the time in which we started this project to this point, gentrification had been a pretty big thing within the Bayview. So using it to talk about, well, who is this space for now? And it ended then with staging the original Question Bridge exhibit on the site. And really the idea with all of these things is never to get to a point where we're, we've solved this issue, we've created something where everybody is like, okay, that's a neat and tidy package, but more the idea of reckoning is that you just don't shy away from the fact that there is a need for a conversation, and how could you design programming in space that enables that conversation to occur. Right now, we're in this interesting place where we're transitioning from our management of the site to a community group. And it's actually allowed this really interesting conversation of, I think sometimes when we think about what we do as designers, we create the thing, we open it, we cut the ribbon, and then we walk away. But for us, we've spent 8 years building a relationship with this community. And so really thinking through how could we use the design process to create an intentional goodbye. And so right now we're collaborating with a local choreographer to design a piece that would be on site, and using the whole process of creating that piece to really speak to like, what is the handoff that we want to do here? And then the final project I'll show is located in Charlottesville, Virginia. It's called Friendship Court. It's a housing development that sits on 11 acres, 150 households. And it's over 40 years old. And in that time, I should say all Section 8 households, about 80% African-American, with another significant amount of the population being refugees, primarily from Afghanistan. And so this place has never had a significant redevelopment. And also, if you think about redevelopment of housing in these times, oftentimes where things go into is mixed use, mixed income housing. And so one of the questions in which I was brought on is, you know, we want to make sure that the residents who are there now feel stewardship over what is to come. So how can we shape a process that enables them to do that? And how can we create a design that builds off of what their desires are for this evolved community? Now, of course, when I talk about what Charlottesville, I imagine that what comes to mind for many of you is the racial incursion that happened in 2017. What you see on the left is 4th Street, where Heather Heyer was murdered. But to put it in context for you, if you were to go 2 blocks down this street, you would hit Friendship Court. So even though I was working on this project prior to 2017, it really became part of, you know, the street was the street that I would always cut to go from downtown to Friendship Court. So it was definitely part of our context, but it's also important to recognize that the racial wounding did not begin in 2017. You could go, you know, back to slavery, and actually there were residents at Friendship Court that used to call the University of Virginia, which is not far from this site, the plantation still. But you could also just go back to the 60s when urban renewal came to a city as small as Charlottesville, and just so happened to raise the more vibrant African-American neighborhoods. Was one called Vinegar Hill, which this is an image of, and even Friendship Court itself was created by clearing away African-American residents. So like that racial wounding is steeped in the history of this place, not just recent history, but the far history as well. So oftentimes when we talk about redevelopment, we think, you know, all right, let's build new housing for these people and that will automatically give them better opportunities. And the reality from seeing tons of these projects happen is to know that no, that is not what's going to happen. And also, if we think about the context that exists, just building new housing is not going to heal those wounds. And so the process that we've been doing of this kind of co-design process where the resident advisory committee that we created has basically been empaneled as co-decision makers in the process. And so what they have said is, and what I've interpreted also from the interviews with them, is building housing does not break the cycle of poverty. And the client there, Sunshine Mathon, who's the ED of the nonprofit that owns this property, has said this line that I quote ad nauseum, which is, if all we do is build housing, we're just helping the poor to be poor better. And so we've really set that our challenge has to be, how do we leverage the investment that comes through redevelopment to actually lift people out of poverty? That if we're going to talk about what true healing is, what true repair is, that has to be our goal. And so with the residents, they identified sort of 4 key areas for them that they would like to see us leverage the resources towards. And so that has overlaid into all the work that we're doing as in terms of actually designing what this looks like when it pops up in reality. And so that means everything from looking at community land trust to cementing resident decision-making to thinking about healing trauma or a financial opportunity center. And really what that means is sort of we're displacing the idea that the goal is about the development, and really the goal is about how are we meaningfully improving people's lives. And so we kind of call those spatial justice pillars, and this is just a zoom in on some of the specific programs that residents have said that they would like to see be part of that this is what they think would help us achieve cultural belonging and empathy. And really, when I talk about repair, I think, you know, one of the final pieces of healing that I'm looking at is like, you know, we talk about reparations in terms of financial payments, which, to be clear, I do think needs to happen. But if that's all we do, then that basically is the Band-Aid piece that gets us back to the complacency. It does not save another generation from going into poverty. So really the idea here is, how do we literally use the transformation of the place to ensure that there is long-term generational repair? So for me, healing is really that encapsulation of those things. So this idea of acknowledgement, and listening, and this idea of setting up conditions for reckoning, and then ultimately landing in a place where you're thinking about what does place-based repair look like. And at the center of it, it's really all of the community members that I come into contact with as part of my projects. And one of the things that I say is that I often feel like I serve two clients, the people who pay me and the people who have to live with what's created. And I think our system, sort of honors and has space for the former, but not so much this. And so part of my work in trying to get at what does healing look like is to make sure that I set up the terms and conditions where these folks actually have a seat at the table and can actually help us shape what repair and healing looks like. I'd said this at a talk I gave a while ago, and I think that from somebody tweeted this, that they used it as a mantra every day, which I'm like, oh, that's super cool. But I share it here just to say in particular that I think this idea of where, like, the very first step, I think, to talk about what healing could mean is like, how are we creating relationships? That I think some of how we get into this transaction between urgency and complacency is that what we see as the point to get to is where we can no longer be comfortable, no longer uncomfortable, and how we can only operate within the conditions that the system tells us are the conditions we get to shape. And so if we were actually to move into a place where we're in sacred relationship with people, I think there are things that we accept now that we would not find acceptable. And so I think in my work, I really push for like, what does it mean to be in that sacred relationship, both with the people we traditionally have seen as clients, but also with this new form of client. And so just to leave you with, these are kind of, what I mentioned and sort of three questions that I'm really thinking about, like how are we holding space to acknowledge that harm has been done here, and how do we start our projects with that? How are we reckoning with who was harmed and how? And I also think sometimes we tend to only shine a light on the sort of the poor communities, the Black folks, the people who we feel like we must go and save, which is a whole other conversation about design savior complex. But I think we don't also hold to account who is benefited and how. And I think if we're really to talk about what it means to interrogate complicity, both of ourselves and the system, that's a really important question to ask. And then finally, are we letting the terms and conditions of repair and healing be determined by those who were most harmed in the past? And also, are those terms and conditions rooted in a new way of being and relating? So I think we have to go in with the assumption that the systems that we shape so much of our projects is kind of rotten to the core. And so as we're creating these projects, really thinking through like, what would it mean to not operate in the existing context, which is really shaped around harming many and benefiting a very few. And so a lot of my work is like, how can I hold that bigger question, even if like I'm just working on a pop-up park? And so I'll just leave you with this quote from Arundhati Roy. She wrote a beautiful essay called "The Pandemic is a Portal" last summer in Fortune magazine. If you did not read it, go read it. But in it, she said that nothing could be worse than a return to normal. And so if you take anything from my talk today, I hope it is this. And I hope it is that even if you think that you don't touch that much, you do. And how in the actions that you do, whether it's in school or in your practice, or just in relating to the other folks in your life, that you really take that we cannot return to where we came from, that we need to really think about what are new systems that we create where everybody has a right to belong and exist and is surrounded by spaces that support their ability to do so. So with that, thank you. And I'm happy to be in conversation and take questions. You're on mute.
I was waiting for that. There always has to be one, right? There always has to be one. Well, thank you so much, Liz. I've got a list of questions myself, and thank you for shedding continued light on a really important topic, for our students. And so before we move into the Q&A, I just want to, thank you again for rounding out this semester's lecture series. I invite all the students and everybody else in attendance to look forward to also information about our lecture series in the spring. And I just want to, I guess, give you the best Zoom equivalent of an applause before we move on to the Q&A session. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and go to the Q&A, and I encourage all of those in the audience, if you have questions, go ahead and keep populating them. So I'm just going to start right from the top here. We have a question from Aubrey. And so I'm just going to read the entire thing here, no editing. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. Second that. So in your opinion, how can architecture schools better integrate spatial justice into the curriculum? And then the second part of that question is, and how can students further engage in these conversations of spatial justice while still in school?
So those are great questions. So on the first point about the curriculum, so a program that I've been involved in for, actually we're about to hit our 10th year now, is called Design Futures. And it was actually created in part because we realized that issues of spatial justice were not being covered adequately in the curriculum of most design schools. And so we actually built up a university consortium. And every year, 10 to 15 universities send 5 students and a faculty member to the program. We set the main part of the program happens right after spring semester. And it's basically a week-long program with master classes that are taught by people who do things, engaging spatial justice, everything from like, what does engagement look like? How do you finance these projects, et cetera? And the whole goal is to actually build skills and knowledge around how can you apply theories in spatial justice to design work. And it's been really successful. We've sort of seen a lot of spillage from the different schools across the country that have participated. If USC is interested, we still have slots for 2022, which will be hosted by UVA. And it's a really like magical thing. And we also have a faculty program where there's a faculty convening every January. And that has a mix of university faculty and practitioners who talk about this issue as well. So I think there's a website, look towards that stuff to sort of see ways that you can integrate it into the curriculum. We sort of publish a yearbook every year that talks about what were some of the trainings that we had. And I think a lot of those trainings speak to things I think should be a part of the curriculum. And I will say we do a kind of core elective setup. And in the core, if it helps to sort of frame what we think is the core curriculum, we do history of the built environment, but we just don't do like, Vitruvius and Corb and stuff like that. Oh, great. Thank you for reminding me that you guys participated. In the Zoom world, I didn't catch who all the schools were. But like history of the built environment, but we talk about issues like redlining and blockbusting and how that impacted the neighborhoods that we see. We also did a course that formerly was called Oppression 101. We changed up the name this past year, and I can't remember all the different things, but it's basically like, how do the systems, is involved in the systems of oppression? Like, what does that look like? So that folks have the language to be able to talk about it, both at a system level and a person level. And I co-taught with Christine Gaspar and Claire, blank on Claire's last name, from CUP, a power, privilege, and positionality. So like, how do we think about privilege and what does that mean both for us personally and in our work? So that just gives a lens to some of the things that I think should be part of the curriculum. And then in terms of students getting engaged, I think I was just commenting to this to somebody at another university recently that I think as students, in some ways, you lead where the conversation should be because you have the most immediacy and intimacy with like what the potential impacts of us not talking about this stuff and not getting it right. So I think I would start with partly what are the issues that you are seeing out in the world that you think are important for us to bring, and just agitate for that to be part of the curriculum and agitate for that to be part of your studio projects. But then I also think, in this world of COVID has disrupted so much, but one of the cool things that I think has happened is that there are a lot of trainings, lectures, things that would have historically only happened in person somewhere have actually been broadcast out that you can actually be able to attend. So I would take advantage of opportunities to avail yourself of gaining that knowledge that exists outside of school. So looking at groups like the Othering and Belonging Institute, or Kimberly Crenshaw's group, they're constantly offering programs. Policy Link is another great organization. So looking at the programs that are being offered by those groups, and just, I mean, I know it's hard with coursework, you have a lot on your plate, but if you can just pop into a lecture, just let that expand your mind, and then bring that stuff back to your studio and seminar projects.
Great. Thank you for that answer. I'm going to move on to the next question here. And so this question asked, what is the importance of being an architect in your work? And the second part of that question, I guess, is as opposed to other practices of space making or design, both in quotes.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the funny thing is, I feel like, even though I call myself an architect and I'm trained in architecture and that's definitely my core wheelhouse, I'm sort of design agnostic, right? Like I'm willing to use whatever design tool is appropriate for the given moment. I am not, my ego is not so glued to the architecture label that that's the only thing that I can see. And I actually think that that's really important. And you know, people talk about code switching when it comes to race, but I also think there's a version of code switching when it comes to design. And understanding that, like, one of the challenges I think of architects getting engaged in this conversation is there are not a lot of people who are convinced that we are relevant to the conversation. There's a lot of people who think that what architecture is building houses for rich people. And so for me, in some rooms, me saying I'm an architect is automatically a place of dismissal of like, well, then you don't have anything to add here. So I would say that, you know, sometimes I wear that hat when it is useful, right? Like when it's that I can offer some particular advice about what are the spatial implications of this decision that we are dealing with. But there are other times where it's actually me sort of going stealth and not calling myself an architect have an advantage, because then I can say, oh, I'm a spatial justice activist, right? And so then, you know, someone's like, all right, well then as we talk about how do we design this poverty program, I see you have something to share in that context, right? So I think I often operate at the intersection of design and engagement. I design the systems that talk about how do we talk to people. I design the systems that talk about how do we translate what we've heard. And then I participate in the systems that talk about, well, like, then how does that manifest in built form or space? And so all of that is kind of intermingled to the point that I can't really tell you like where the architect part of me begins and ends, because it kind of comes into these very fluid ways. But I do try to make the case for why it is important that we do not neglect space from this conversation. That I don't actually think, as long as we are separated and selectively harmed by space, I don't actually think we ever achieve racial justice. So part of my evangelizing to people is that, like, don't discount space from the conversation. It actually shapes a lot.
Fantastic. And I think that rolls great into our next question here. This next question says, I love what you said about apocalypse as an unveiling in relation to last summer's racial reckoning. I also love your note about being a caretaker of the built environment. And it also seems worth noting that this type of labor is often feminized and racialized. The work of caretaking at any scale is tremendous, and I'm curious what kind of tools you turn to find grounding. Are there structures that you found along the way that reduce harm in the face of high exposure?
Excellent question. I think, I had been on this track pre-pandemic, but I think it increased significantly during the pandemic. I'm a heavy meditator. So that is like a core part of my self-care practice. I think I'm also, you know, I'm very clear on when I need rest, right? And so, and stepping away from things and not carrying too much of the emotional weight that comes through the process of doing these projects, which means that, you know, when I am there, I am deeply grounded. If you want to have a conversation with me about your murdered son, I can hold that space. And I think one of the things that makes me successful in the work is people feel like I actually am there. I'm there to listen. I'm there to hold the space. But then my practice has to be that when I go home, I have a way of releasing that. And so some of that is, pre-pandemic was like spa dates, but meditation, I have a therapist who like I love dearly. And then I also have a group of friends and colleagues where they offer space for me to just like unleash onto them, right? Like they hold me and they allow me to exist in a place of like kind of critical practice. And then one of the things that I've been doing throughout the pandemic, just as I sort of encourage students to take advantage of a lot of the stuff that's getting offered, I've been doing that. So, I took a 3-month embodied social justice certificate course because I wanted to learn about how trauma sits in my body and sits in the body of the communities that I'm working with, so that I could also learn like what are strategies for releasing. And so there's a lot in the world of somatics that talk about how to release. Some of it's as simple as just like doing a body scan and just recognizing when you are triggered. Even, almost if you think about COVID and there's all of these cases of like asymptomatic people, right? Like they're COVID positive, but they don't show the signs, or not in the like hacking and collapsing type of way. Trauma works like that too, right? Like that we're all traumatized, but like a lot of us have become very good at masking it, right? But if you were to actually sit for a moment and just gauge where trauma is sitting in your body, maybe you have a stiff neck, maybe you're like really, really tense. Maybe there's some back pain that started for you in this pandemic that hadn't really been there before. Those are all signs of trauma. And so part of the somatic work is like, what can we do to like just do an instant release of that part of your body? So I think I spent a lot more time thinking about like, how's my physical condition and making sure that I'm taking care of that. But I also want to note in the question that the idea that there's a lot of feminine labor and there's a lot of racial labor is also a truth. But I think of it both in, yes, there's a lot that gets unnecessarily placed, but I also think I'm very explicit with people of, I have one project where the team is going through some anti-racist work right now. And I've been very clear that although I am very well versed in how to do that, it is not my labor to hold that for the team. And I made the sort of paying client get a consultant who will hold that for the team. So some of it is like being really clear about drawing your lines on these things. And then I think the other thing is also to just acknowledge the like fact that like women and people of color by virtue, and there are other sort of identities that fit outside of the norm, by virtue of fitting outside of the norm, that we've developed skills and wisdom that's pretty powerful and that the world will need to look to be the guiding light of how do we get out of this mess. And so I also want to honor that, like, yes, while there's some unfairness and you need to be really clear about how do you take care of yourself and how do you draw some boundaries so that you don't get taken advantage of, I also think let us harness this power, because I think within these groups there's the keys to liberation.
Fantastic. All right, this next question asks, what was the process of starting your firm centering around spatial justice? And I'm going to slip in a second question of my own to tag onto that, because I'm also intrigued as perhaps in addition to that, how have you seen, I would say, this evolution? Because, spatial justice is a term, and how has that evolved, let's say, in the decades since that term sort of came into existence? And perhaps how does that connect to the work in the way in which you approach it?
Yeah, so I think I joke that I kind of backed into forming this firm in that, I just found that what I wanted to do didn't really fit within any existing company that I was talking to. But I also, my career has spanned these really interesting trajectories. One, and I joke about this at the beginning of my TED Talk, that like, I was the weird kid in my family who drew, but I grew up in a family of social scientists. So I grew up talking about people. And I was really fortunate that when I got to Wellesley, there actually was no architecture department. There was a major, but there wasn't a department. So you could effectively design the major. And so because of my upbringing, I didn't understand how I could just take architecture courses without also taking courses in urban sociology and urban economics. Like, what was the people part of the space thing? So for me, spatial justice in many ways was like a natural thread and landing point from like holding that those two things were really important to understanding space. But then I worked for public architecture when it first started. I worked for IDEO.org when it first started. And so really got a sense of the landscape of like, I was of these practices that were really talking about like, well, how could we scale up this idea of design and social impact? And so the spatial justice piece for me, I think, really came about when I realized that if all we do is talk about social impact, we're not necessarily, it's sort of like, okay, let's build some affordable housing, or let's build a park in a neighborhood that doesn't have any. But we're not actually solving the problem of generations of harm, right? Like, impact is not a deep enough question. It is not asking for me to interrogate in any way the complicity of the design profession in setting up the conditions that we're seeing. And it's allowing me, I often say there's a difference between doing good and doing right. And doing good is about how I feel, and doing right is about how I'm holding myself accountable. And so if we only talk about impact, social design, like that very much is in the vein of doing good. And if I talk about spatial justice and hold myself accountable to like really being clear on what that justice looks like, then that gets into the doing right piece, where it's like, oh, my work is not done until people are free. And like the things that I create need to participate in that. And if they don't, then that is on me to interrogate the why. And so to go to your second part of the question of the evolution, I think if we talk about what community engaged design, social impact design, public interest design was a decade ago, it was really existing in this vein of like the pretty pictures of, the housing, the park, the cool product, that was enough, right? That just the fact that we were lending design services to these communities, to these places, that was enough. Whereas now I think there's like a real interrogation of complicity. And I think there's a real sort of awakening that that there's a longer project that we need to be involved in. And we need to also have a place to account for the ways in which space has been used as an instrument of harm before. And I'm finding that clients are actually really open to this. Not all clients, but I definitely have more work and more people knocking on my door than I have an ability to serve, which I think is a sign of, when I hear people talk about what the sustainability movement was like in the beginning, right, where there were just a few people who were doing it, but that really wasn't something that a lot of people thought about, to the point of where you can't talk about a project without talking about what are the sustainable components of it. I'm seeing that kind of transition happen with some of the justice work as well.
Okay, great, thank you. So it looks like we have got time for 2 more questions. I'm going to kind of quickly scan through here. Thank you so much to the students who are asking some really thought-provoking questions here. Let's see here. Going to go to this question here. Thank you so much for a wonderful lecture and the work you've been doing. This healing process of design involves the voices of non-traditional stakeholders and what I would assume may be different timelines. When thinking about how interdisciplinary this scale of design is, what other disciplines should we as architecture and design students build relationships with while we are in school? And if you could suggest another certificate option, what would it be? Yeah, that's easy. That's oh, yeah.
Okay. How much time do we have?
Yeah.
I'm going to punt on the certificate option, just because I think I attended a talk in a class that I'm taking right now from this guy who talked about how we have this desire to commodify knowledge, to legitimize that, okay, this is a thing, we got this certificate, we got this thing. And so I think it's less about, I studied anthropology and sociology in school. I don't have a certificate or a minor to speak to it, but it weaves its way into what I do. So I just want to sort of say, that's a whole longer conversation, but I don't know that I can say there's a certificate you should do. But I would say the social sciences are really important. Talk to some anthropologists, sociologists. Economics is really important because I think so much of the things that shape space have everything to do with racialized capitalism, and it's really important to understand that. Public health is super important because there is like some very important connections between space and health and well-being. Let's see, what else? Politics, government, right? Like so much that shapes what we do is by the policies. And so figuring out how like those policies get shaped and actually getting folks who are like going to be your future legislators to actually understand the importance of space and that how their decisions impact space is huge. So those are kind of just a few that I think are worthwhile.
Okay, great. So right, for the last question, let's see what we're going to, okay, I'm going to go with this one here, is thank you so much for this lecture and your time. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about place-based reparation for space that have already undergone significant gentrification, and do you know of any projects that have done this successfully, in your opinion?
No. Short answer.
Short answer.
No, I don't know of any projects that have done it well after, but I think we're seeing a crop of projects that are wrestling with like, oh, we need to think about this now. So like right now I'm working on a project in Akron, Ohio, there's a freeway classic built in the Black neighborhood in the 60s. They've cleared a bunch of people. We're now talking about what it means I've been hired to basically lead the process to figure out what should be done on that land. And one of the things we're talking about is like, how can we put an equitable development frame on top of it? Because we know that investment coming in will potentially trigger gentrification. So like, how do we hold that? The project that is like kind of way ahead on this is the 11th Street Bridge Park in Washington, DC. Strangely, I actually think the architecture part of it is pretty divorced from the community development part. So the part I'm lauding to look at is the community development part. The architecture is amazing. It's a OMA Olin project, so it's beautiful, of course. But one of the things that they did is like, so it's basically taking a freeway bridge that goes across the Anacostia. And I'm of course blanking on the two neighborhoods on either side of it, but one is a pretty poor community of color. The other one's a pretty well-off, mostly white community. And there was a sense that once this gets turned into this like signature hundreds of millions of dollar park, it's going to trigger gentrification in the poor neighborhood, because all of a sudden this neighborhood that was seen as not so hot is going to be an amazing place to come and live. And so, you know, because these projects take so long to reach fruition, one of the things that there was a nonprofit formed, and its remit was, how are we basically building the capacity of people to stay, to be able to take advantage of the benefits that come? So they created a home buyers club to like actually set people up who are like currently renters to perhaps transition into home ownership. They did workforce development programs to actually make sure that they could do stuff that would help actually increase the incomes of people. They created an economic development plan that actually set targets for what, you know, actually prioritize what are the communities that need to be impacted and how based on this. So like they've been running a series of programs over probably at this point 5 years that are aimed at getting this community ready so that they have a chance to withstand the shock of what happens when this investment happens. And I think that's really important, because oftentimes the thing is, well, you know, investment lifts all boats and we just let economic forces be what they are. But we never, you know, to that point of holding ourselves accountable, we never hold ourselves accountable to what happens. How do we make sure that people can actually stay to benefit, or at least make the choice to leave and not be forced to displace them? So I think it's really worthwhile to sort of check out some of these emergent projects right now that are like trying to actually wrestle with this. as they are doing the project? And maybe I'll be able to answer that question in like 5 years.
Okay. Well, we look forward to following all the work that you're doing and seeing how that pans out in 5 years in the coming decades. So I think with that, we're going to close this Q&A. And once again, I want to give you a special thank you, Liz, for making time for us here at the USC School of Architecture. As I mentioned before, this is our last lecture of the semester. This is a final week of school. I want to thank also all the students and faculty in attendance. I actually don't know who they are. And thank you for everybody who's put a question into the Q&A. And I would say, just in closing, I would wish everybody an enjoyable rest of the semester. And then I would maybe also add to continue the conversation outside of this space, with your colleagues and your fellow students. And with that, we'll bid you adieu. So good night, everyone, and we will see you soon.